Hello and welcome to a Sonic Lab, and yes, we finally got our hands on the UDO Audio Super 6, which is the brand new polyphonic synth from UDO Audio, who are based in Bristol. The main guy behind it is George Hearn. If you follow Sonicstate at all, you'll probably seen various interviews with him over the life of this, but now this is actually shipping. He's a real synth enthusiast. It's great. He's one of those people that sort of, when he talks about synths, you just can't help but watch. And as such, people have been following this with great interest. I mean, it's not the cheapest instrument. I mean, it's a small boutique manufacturer, but it is a nicely made thing. And George has been making synthesizers either privately or when I think his first commercial product was the what's it called? Modal Electronic 008, which was a big analog beast. Now this is a different thing altogether. What we have here is a 6-voice binaural synthesizer. So that means each voice is kind of got a stereo aspect to it, but you can run it in non-binaural mode, which means you get 12 voices. At its heart is the FPGA. Now the FPGA, for those of you maybe not familiar with these things, it's a specialized chip which is very used for running high audio rate, high sample rate code, ideal for audio, and lots of manufacturers are starting to use it, and it takes a sort of, you can program oscillators and all kinds of stuff in it. And George's oscillators are called, they're called Super DDS, and he's got 2 of them. Then we've also got an analog SSI chip, 4-pole low-pass resonant filter, a couple of envelopes, a couple of LFOs. This LFO is interesting in that it goes right up into audio rates and can be tracked, so it can act as another source. 128 memories, which is a little on the low side. Chorus and delay, arpeggio sequencer, and these performance controls. And this is a really nice 4-octave aftertouch enabled keyboard, not poly aftertouch, though this will respond to MPE. Those of you, like I say, who've been following Sonic will know that this has been generating a lot of interest, and people who've heard it and who've already maybe got hold of theirs are saying, wow, it sounds great. So let's take a look and see what it's all about, shall we? So let's look at these oscillators. These are code, basically, running on the FPGA. We've got DDS1 and DDS2. DDS1 seems quite simple, 64 to 2 feet, got a good wide range. Start with a sine wave. We're in binaural mode, which means that we've got a slight discrepancy between the left and right. Just gives it a little bit of extra movement. If I bring the screen up, you can see that there's a really good, solid fundamental, but also a nice shape. Sawtooth. Again, a really tasty, all the way across, nice, solid, really plenty of low end in that and plenty of buzz as well, and a pretty good shape. Then we've got a square wave. Triangle. Noise, and also user waves, or not user waves, but extra waves that we can load in, and we just do that by 16 of them that give us additional harmonics to play with when used against the other oscillator. Just coming back to this whole kind of stereo binaural thing, if I switch the binaural off and I bring up my little meter, you can see each time I press a note, we've got a bit of stereo movement, because when it's not in stereo mode, they kind of like, they're assigned so they come out a little bit left of centre or right of centre, depending on the voice allocation. Switching binaural in gives us a more central stereo image. But then if we come to this section, if I take this out, we come to this section, this is where we bring in the Super DDS. The Super DDS kind of, what it does is it clones up to 6 oscillators. This only works on DDS1 against the central one and creates a sort of stereo spread and detune. So let's just demonstrate that. I'll do it with the sawtooth, it's a bit easier to hear. that's half, and that's 50%. So if I bring the stereo width signal up, you can see that we get a lot more stereo width going on there. Now, one nice thing that I liked was just going into a sine wave, bringing up the release, bring it up an octave. And this is cloning all of those 6 oscillators. If you get the nice view of the stereo image. And that's no effects going on there at all. That's just using the binaural thing. Switch the binaural off, we get the 12 voices. We're still getting the cloning, but we get 12 voices. And obviously the stereo imaging is effectively throwing each consecutive voice out either left or right. Oscillator 2 is essentially the same waves. We don't get the additional waves, but we've got instead a pulse width, which is kind of nice to see. And I can manually change that. Let's bring the wave up. And I can modulate that with LFO1. So we got through 0. Always nice to see that. One thing that's kind of weird is this plus or minus 6 doesn't seem to relate to semitones, because I can get to a 5th. Switch into binaural mode. I think it goes maybe 11 semitones plus or minus, so not quite an octave, just a bit unusual. Another couple of things, if we wanted to go into, we've got sub-oscillator, we just go LFO mode, and then we get a square wave an octave below this. And then we've also got the audio in, which would take stereo in from, there's a jack on the back here, audio in, which allows us to bring a mix in via the mixer, VCF, VCA, and out into the rest of the synth engine. So there's also a sync mode. If we switch into sync mode and I come out a bit wider, I've got the pitch of DDS2 going via envelope 1 over here. So now I've got the sync sound. I've got a patch here which I program, which you might recognise. Anyway, leave that in the comments if you do. There's also a crossfade mode, which enables us to blend the oscillators left and right of a keyboard split on the keyboard, which kind of you almost get duotimbral, though not quite. These oscillators sound good. I mean, that's the one thing, when I switched it on, I went, I wonder what the raw oscillators sound like. You go, oh gosh, that's nice. There's just, you know, the code that makes them, I don't care whether they're digital or analog, they've got beef. They really do sound very impressive. And there's some mono sounds in here that are absolutely monstrous. See if I can find one just to prove. So we go patch, I think it's this one, yeah. They sound very beefy. We've got, in terms of keyboard mode, got solo, legato, unison. If we go into shift, we can set unison mode, which goes fifths, octaves, and then a chord as well. So quite a lot of potential there in terms of oscillator assignment. But all I was trying to really point out is the oscillators sound massive. Some of these patches are enormous. Another thing to bear in mind, we've got crossmod here, so if we bring this over, so we're just listening to DDS1, now DDS2 is modulating DDS1, and this is the amount. So we've got quite a lot of possibility. I didn't notice that changing the waveform made any difference to the modulator waveform. It seems to be only derived from the frequency, and it sounds like maybe it's a sine wave. I don't know. My ears aren't that tuned to FM. And of course, we also didn't mention LFO mode. So if we switched a DDS2 into LFO mode, we can use this as a VCR, as an LFO, which is actually quite useful because then that frees up the main LFOs for doing other duties. There's quite a lot of modulation stuff going on here. In fact, we can cross-mod here. We can also use DDS2 frequency to modulate the filter. And this is the one thing, again, with this instrument, there's quite a lot of, even though the front panel seems to be very simple, you know, there's no menus. There's a bit of shift functionality, but it's actually quite clear and straightforward. And all of these things are quite quick to navigate around, but it can still get you into a lot of little synthesis nooks and crannies. Time for a few patches. I basically just went through and programmed a few starting from one bank and just heading up. So here's a couple. This just has a sequence running. Using a very fast delay on this for that sort of pingy quality. This one I really like. I'm using the looping envelope to create this rhythmic sound. This one is a very atmospheric. Not actually sure what happened on this one. It's hard to be totally sure. One thing that is I haven't mentioned yet is we've got these modulation assignments, so we can assign sources along here to destinations along here with a depth control that gives us positive and negative amounts, and that I'm using some of that on here, but I couldn't tell you what. This one is just a nice kind of pad, which is using the DDS2 to modulate the VCF. This one is another interesting choral floaty pad. I think I use this at the top of the review. They're using probably sine wave on the left, DDS, and then again, just a bit of delay on this, I think. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's listen to the filter, because this is the analog part of the instrument. So I said the analog component, obviously the VCA is analog as well. I did forget to mention that. So this is a sawtooth going into the SSI 4-pole low-pass filter. And we do lose a bit of low end when we bring the resonance in. Lovely harmonics though. Nice integration between the digital tracking of the oscillators and the frequency. So we've also got drive capabilities here, so we can have we can create quite a lot of additional drive through this, and it affects the characteristic of the resonance. There's also quite a lot of other modulation possibilities. So if I just bring the LFO in, this is LFO1. LFO1 is quite interesting because it has a number of different features. We've got obviously a delay, we've got a phase, we can go into triangle, square, random, sawtooth, and these are the high frequency modes. More on that in a bit. So this is basically the LFO, but because we're in binaural mode, when I bring the LFO, I can change the phase. So we end up with the modulation being stereo, so we end up with this sort of stereo filter. I think that's why when we switch binaural mode, we're getting 6 voices as opposed to 12. I come out of binaural mode, it's not stereo, but in binaural mode, we can modulate the phase of the LFO on the filter, which is actually quite a nice touch. There's a lot more we can do with the filter as well. Let's just take the LFO out. Obviously, we've got an envelope. Drive, so you get that sort of crunchy sound. We've got the ability to run that in inverse and also in a loop mode. So we can get that into quite high audio rate. Not syncable as far as I can tell. So, but it is another sort of interesting modulation source in case we didn't want to use one of the LFOs. But yeah, not only that, we can also modulate it from DDS2. So that means audio rate, talking filter kind of stuff. That's nice. While I'm on the subject of the LFO and modulation, LFO1 is a really interesting. I mentioned briefly about the high frequency mode. Now, if we go into high frequency mode, we've got the ability to modulate. If we use LFO1, very high frequency. But also, if we go to high frequency track, this is something very different. It's quite an interesting idea. So basically, that then means that if we go to DDS1, we're listening to the pitch of the LFO, which is tracked, and the pitch of DDS1 coming out of the DDS1 mix. Now, you might think that is just a single fixed wave, but actually there's a really cool feature, and I'm pretty sure it was something I suggested when I saw a prototype. It might actually be a feature that I suggested, which makes me feel pretty warm inside. So essentially, it sounds like this is a sine wave, but what we can do, if we press Shift, and let's say we'll take that to a sawtooth. We press Shift and we move this one notch. Now this should take the wave from DDS1. And we can then change the wave of DDS1, but keep the wave that we've got here. This also applies to the 16 additional waves. We can also load those into the main LFO. So I've got a patch here, which I created earlier, which has 3 basically VCOs or 3 oscillators. So on this side, we've just got I think it's a sine wave with a bit of super DDS, and then on this side, we've got the LFO, which is tuned to that higher note. But I'm also modulating the LFO from this, so I'm getting a bit of wobble on there. But then if I switch this in, but the other thing that's very cool is because I've got delay here, I'm actually delaying the amplitude of and the bringing in of this third oscillator. If I bring straight in, I've also got a little bit of that also modulating the filter, so it's just a lovely sound. So yeah, we can basically get a 3 oscillator polysynth out of this, and that will be across 12 voices. I'm currently in binaural mode, but if I take out a binaural mode, I basically got 12 voices of a 3 oscillator polysynth, but I'm sacrificing LFO1. But I can loop the envelope. I've got this LFO here. I've got the ability to modulate with the, with the, there's a lot of other things I can make up for sacrificing that main LFO. The only thing you can't do is actually change the relative levels of this as an oscillator against either of these as an oscillator. It's just a fixed mix. Okay, we should probably just take a look at some of the other waves, because we've only really listened to the main analog modelled. So this sound here is using the wave on the DDS1. I'm using, let's see if I go to wave mode, I'm using wave 5. And switching waves out. There's a sort of slight flavour of LA synthesis about it, because it's sort of replacing, I guess these are PCMs, I'm not entirely sure what the format is, but it gives you that extra flavour. I mean, it sort of sounds quite, there's a sort of PPG-ness to it as well. It's that extra sparkle and shimmer. Obviously we can't scan through any wavetables, there's no scanning, but it's just the possibility of having those extra waves gives us these more sparkly and interesting sounds. As it stands, you'll be able to load those additional user waves via USB, mount this like a USB drive and drop the files in. As far as I'm aware, these are only going to be released by UDO as additional waves, and so you'll have to manage it. I don't think there's a user way to create them. But it does bring up an interesting point about firmware generally. The firmware on this is actually pretty solid. I know they've been working quite hard on it. There's going to be a few more tweaks to the sequencer and a few other things. And there's a roadmap for stuff that hasn't yet been implemented that will be. First of those is going to be MPE. I can't show you MPE on this, although there is actually a button for it on the front panel. It's not yet been implemented in firmware. The other thing that hasn't been implemented yet is USB over MIDI. MIDI ports work fine, just not the USB over MIDI. So not major omissions, and you can be sure that they're working on them pretty hard. So the next thing we should look at is the mod matrix, because there's an 8x8 on the front panel, which gives us 8 sources and 8 destinations. These are fixed using this method. So if I wanted to route maybe LFO2 to the cross mod depth, I would dial it in using the rotary pot here, positive or negative. It's quite an elegant and simple system. If I wanted to go direct, I would press and hold, and then maybe let's move a front panel parameter, in this case DDS2. The only thing I would say is if I wanted to clear that and then do it again, it flips me back to patch mode, which means if I pressed and held that, I'd be storing this. So I must remember to go there. So press, that shows that it's assigned, and then dial in the amount. Interesting. It does say that any of the front panel controls that aren't switches should be freely assignable, but I personally, because I wanted this, I wanted the mixer control to be assigned, but if I press and hold, it doesn't seem to do that one, so maybe everything apart from that, or maybe that's something that can come along in a new firmware update. Now, as far as destinations go, there's no limit on the number of destinations it can go. You can only have obviously 8 sources, but you can stack them up. Everything that's on the front panel that is assignable, apart from I found the mix control and obviously any switches, and I think there's maybe 1 or 2 others, means that you can stack them up so they can go to as many destinations as possible. There is no limit. So that means that the modulation matrix, even though it's only 8 by, it's 8 by any of the other parameters, so you get quite a lot of variance there. I just want to play a couple more sounds because there is a real sort of impressive quality and character to this. When you plug it in and switch it on, it sort of goes, ooh, and you do, I'm not sure how much of this is going to come across via the YouTube compression and all the other stuff that happens, but in the room, this thing really does sort of, it feels bold and big. And I just wanted to make sure that that came across. Let's try a couple more sounds. This one is, again, sort of shows the power of the mono in legato mode. I mean, that is shaking the room. So in terms of the sort of weight of these oscillators, they really are quite beefy. And if we come back again and look at the voice assign section, we're in legato mode. Let's just go into unison. This might be too much. So if I press shift, unison, more unison. I think that's actually an octave unison by the sound of it. Fifth unison, and then a chord unison. It's using a bit of aftertouch. Some very impressive sounds. This sound starts to bring in the arpeggiator, because obviously we have an arpeggiator and a sequencer in there, so let's take a look at that as well. So let's just go into hold mode, start with, I guess we're in just up mode, 1 octave range, play a few notes. Try a bit. Up, down, random. If we press sync, the delay will tempo sync to the arpeggiator. That's good. Only thing is, if I wanted to then go round to up, I'll swap these. I've got to go via the sequencer, which means it would stop, so I won't do that. Let's try the swing. So adding swing, we press shift, and then this button here brings a bit of swing in. Bit more. No, that's not quite working. That feels like there's too much swing. The swing is a little bit overpowering. It needs to have a slightly less setting, because even in 1, it's too much. It's not very musical, so maybe they can tinker with that a little bit. Tempo goes from, what's that, 30 to 300 BPM. Let's see what that sounds like. That's quite nice and quite useful. Usually they only go up to 240 these, so it's nice to see that extra 60 BPM. There's no divisions on the arpeggiator, so I suppose that's probably why we've got a wider tempo range. Okay, so let's get on to the sequencer. I'm going to clear the sequence, so now I can just go into on and record. Now, the first thing you'll notice is there seem to be 16 notes populating this. This is actually a 64-step sequencer, and it seems like the default sequence, you know, a cleared sequence, just has a note inhabiting every step. I'm not quite sure why that is, but that's the way it seems to be. So now if I go into, I'm in record mode, hit my first step, let's play a few notes in here. So there are my notes. I've got 16 notes in, and now if I just press go, now I can add, I guess I can add slides or holds, an accent. So I've got a little bit of granularity. It's very much of a sort of step sequencer mode. There's no way to record parameters in there. I think there's a way to record some pitch bend in there, and then if you assign the pitch bend, you'd be able to do that. You still get the same limitations of that swing, which is kind of too much. One thing I didn't notice at the time, this tempo is actually becomes beat division. If you go into external clock, so you have an external clock coming in, then this becomes a deep beat division. So you can actually create, you know, a slow beat division, so you'd have a fast tempo with kind of quarter note beats or whatever, and that's what this becomes. So that's actually quite useful. If I now go into take the sequence record off, press go, now what we do, it triggers and we get transpose here. If I want to play over the top of that, I have to go into record mode, take it out of step so I'm not recording any notes, then press go. Now so it's not kind of ideal. It would be better, I think, if actually it defaulted to overdub mode and you had to specifically ask to be in transpose mode, because you're probably more likely to be using overdub mode, I would imagine. I mean, for me, step sequencers aren't my favourite thing in the world anyway, and the one on this is sort of okay, and it's polyphonic, I suppose it's usable. We can store sequences in the memory as well, separately to the patches. But it just doesn't really kind of perform a massively useful function. I mean, it would be much more useful for me if the sample was if the sequencer was simpler and you had perhaps five lanes of parameter recording, so you could use it without notes to just sort of record movements on the front panel. That would be more useful to me. It's just the way I roll with it. But there is a sequencer and that's how it works. So let's take a look at the effects section. We've got a delay in here, which is syncable to the master tempo, and we've got two choruses, a little bit like that kind of Juno 1 and 2. We can have them both on if we want. So I've got a sound here which is quite pleasant. This is a 3 source, so we're using the LFO1 to provide an additional sound source. Let's try the chorus on that. This is not in binaural mode, throws it out quite nicely. Chorus 2. Both together. That's pretty tasty actually, isn't it? Now let's bring the delay in. Yeah, I mean, the effects, they're not spectacularly complex. You know, we haven't got that sort of massive shimmer reverb. We don't have that kind of stuff going on. But we do have this nice delay, and the delay is actually stereo in terms of a stereo in. It's not ping pong or left right as far as I can tell. We've also got those nice wide Juno style choruses. What we can do is we can modulate some of these things. So if I go to mod assign, and I press, let's go for LFO2 and send that to time. Yep, we've assigned that now. Just a little bit. We can access, you know, we can modulate that chorus, you know, we modulate the delay time, we can modulate the level, we can modulate the feedback. So they're quite useful things. And the feedback on this guy, if we take the down to a really tight, let's get. We can get this, and we could, in fact, I think, can we? We can't, doesn't look like we can do note to time, which would be kind of nice for car plus type stuff. But yeah, we've got that kind of quite nice effect. Another area we haven't really looked at on this is the performance aspect. So we've got the ability to assign aftertouch trigger, just bring extra modulation in. just on faders, or have it trigger, or have it triggered by the wheel. We've got bend, which can affect the DDS 1 and 2 both, or individually. So there's no doubt that the Super 6 is a tasty piece of hardware and a quality instrument. A lot of the thought and the care of attention that's gone into making this as complex as it is, without really being, there's no display, very little kind of shift and hidden functions that I can see. It's very easy to use, but also very deep. These oscillators sound really good. They will work as mono or in poly voices as well, and they do sound very good. I guess the sequencer is perhaps the weakest link for me, as is the fact there are only 128 patch storage locations. This is quite low for a modern polysynth, though obviously you can drag and drop them between the computer and the unit via the USB connection. Effects, while limited, just do have a really good sound. So, I mean, it's a question of whether or not you want to buy this level of quality, because the components and all the kind of attention to detail adds up. These are small guys, they're not a megacorp, and they've gone for the price of £2,200, which is not insignificant. Other currencies will scroll below, but what you do get is something of great quality. So before I play out, just want to say thank you very much for watching. If you want to support us on Patreon, where we'll be posting additional content, some on the Super 6 and some on the other reviews and just extra bits and pieces, head over to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/soniclab.com. That's it. See you next time.